before the missile crisis of October 1962, so that actually never took place. However, you know, I have seen documents in which that was one of the things that were proposed by RAND planners as among a slew of possibilities to be considered if and when it was necessary by the United States. I've also seen the documents as well from the Pentagon as well, from the chiefs of staff who were pressing President Kennedy to go ahead with the Northwood Plan and, you know, go ahead and just find a pretext to go in and invade Cuba. So those are things that have always been taken into consideration. You have to realize that what the RAND Corporation does is to come up with a whole slew of what-if scenarios. What will we do under this? What will we do under that? If this happens, what do we do then? If that happens, what do we do in that case? And they never stop to think, is that the right thing to do? There's a total immorality in the plans of an organization like the RAND Corporation. A total immorality in their planning, in their thinking, because they're just there to propose alternatives. They're not there to tell the powers that be, this is right or this is wrong. Their excuse is that they're just not responsible for whatever actions these people actually will take according to the plans that they propose. Of course, they know, or they should know, that when you're framing the argument, when you're saying these are the different things that you can do, that therefore you're giving carte blanche to any one of those things to happen, even though some of those may be ethically repugnant to most people on this earth. Such as, for instance, a false flag, attacking another country under pretext because saying that country attacked us, or authorizing torture, or so many other things, or even nuclear attacks. I mean, when you have a plan that says, well, we should actually attack this particular city and that particular city because therefore we'll be eliminating half of the population and the other half then will die off because of nuclear fallout, and yet to pretend that that doesn't have any ethical consequences is totally immoral. And that's what I find objectionable in all the plans that are created by RAND, but not only by RAND, by most think tanks. Because nowhere in the universe is there a moral compass. Is there someone somewhere saying, that is just plain wrong, and that's not what this country's all about. And we, as advocates, and as thinkers, and as Americans, cannot stand for that. Nowhere in any of their plans do you ever find that. All you ever think of is utility. Will this give me the result that I want? Without thinking, is that the right thing to do? And that's what I find totally objectionable. Well, look, what is the objective of the military-industrial complex? The military-industrial complex obviously has to come up with a bogeyman, has to come up with an enemy for which, or against which, we have to defend ourselves. For a long time, there was the Soviet Union. Then after that, it sort of like became, well, maybe China. And you can see that in the plans that RAND was coming up with. And if you talk to some of the people at RAND, if you talk to, for instance, Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, he himself admits that there were a lot of plans being made about China being our next adversary. Then what happens? We have 9/11. The tragedy of 9/11, and all of a sudden then it became the Middle East. Then we have to find a way to be able to deal with these adversaries that have come up. People who before used to be our allies, all of a sudden are our worst enemies. You know, Saddam Hussein, to whom we gave the weapons so he'd be able to fight Iran, all of a sudden becomes our enemy. He invades a country after we have given him sort of like the green light to go into Kuwait. And he says, no, we can't do that. And then we go in and we decide that he's the enemy. In other words, the military-industrial complex is always looking for an enemy so it can continue building more and more weapons. So there's been a continuity in that ever since the Second World War. What the military-industrial complex wants is to avoid, at all costs, a return to the 1930s. A return to the 1930s not only because President Roosevelt was in power, during which more money was spent on social services and on people than on weapons and on the Pentagon. But because of demobilization that happened during the 1930s, because of the way in which the Pentagon budget was slashed mercilessly, because after all, and with good reason, the president said, we're not at war. There is no reason for us to spend so much money on weaponry. And of course, they'd say, well, but that's how come World War II happened. So after World War II, because of that, there's always been this desire to create an enemy for the military-industrial complex to be able to go back to the government, go back to the American people, and ask for more money. We have enemies. Our enemies are everywhere. So, like I said before, first it was the Soviet Union. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed, then it became China for a while. Then it became Islamofascism, became Al-Qaeda. Then it became the Taliban. I mean, it's like this enemy keeps morphing. Next thing you know, it's going to be your neighbor down the street who all of a sudden is advocating something that is not kosher, that cannot be allowed. And that's where we're heading. So it's just looking, it's like whack-a-mole. It's like, where are we going to find it? Because if it doesn't exist, it will have to be created. The Tea Parties, you know, my heart goes out to them. Because I do believe that the federal government has grown far beyond what it should. And I think more power should be given to local communities. On the other hand, it seems to me that they're not really paying attention to where the real enemy is. I mean, do we really need the kind of Pentagon that we have right now? Who exactly are we fighting? Why exactly are we in Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires? Why are we there? I mean, let them fight their own wars. It's true that we should have helped them, and sure, we could give foreign aid, but to have tens of thousands of our soldiers there exposing themselves for what? To prop up a corrupt government? That it deals in heroin that then comes back to our own country? What are we doing? Yet that has been alleged as the reason why we have to be there, because of some security reason. And so therefore, I mean, I see their point. I see the point that the federal government has expanded, but they're being used. They're being used in the sense that what we have here, again, is a group of people that will manipulate others to whatever degree it can to be able to, believe it or not, increase the budget of the Pentagon, to be able to have more weapons out there, to come up with another enemy that will be able to say, that's the guy that we should be after. I mean, for all we know, maybe then, the next thing we know, we'll be, I don't know, maybe we'll be landing in Nigeria and saying, well, there's a rebellion out there we're going to have to deal with because they're going to take over all of Western Africa. And all of a sudden, Western Africa will become then a place of interest for American forces. Because all of a sudden, maybe there'll be uranium or plutonium or oil or something else that will be deemed in the national interest. And then all the attention will be focused over there. And in order to pay for that, then obviously we're going to have to get rid of Social Security. We're going to have to get rid of the Department of Education. We're going to have to get rid of regulations, the safety net that was instituted to benefit the people of this country in the 1930s by President Roosevelt. Which to me personally, it makes no sense. So that's what I was talking about when I think that they're being misguided and they're being used. It's true that we have debt. It's true that we have to get rid of that debt. And it's true that things have to be cut back. But we also have to see where there are real interests lie and who is our real enemy. Sometimes I think that our real enemy is right here in this country. Well, RAND itself has been called a shadow government. I don't know if you're aware of that. But even back in the 1950s, because so many people went from RAND to the government back to RAND, back to the government, back and forth. It was a revolving door. RAND as a harbor and as the cradle of the military-industrial complex and as the birthplace of the technocratic elite that wants to run this country has been involved in the creation of a shadow government from the very beginning. There's no doubt about that. And it continues to be involved in that kind of thing. And, I mean, a number of these security clearances have been issued to people who have been with RAND in order, I mean, to this day, 50% of the work that RAND does is for the federal government. And a great deal of that is still classified, top secret. Matter of fact, you can't even talk about it, because were we to talk about it, because of something called the Patriot Act, which I really appreciate the irony of that, we'd be put in jail for even mentioning it. So let me just say this to that. Yes, RAND has been involved. Yes, RAND scientists and researchers and ex-government officials who then become government officials and then become RAND researchers and scientists are involved. And yes, it continues. And the only way we can get rid of that is by making people aware that their liberties are being taken from them, and that we have to stop this kind of nonsense, that we have to stop this revolving door of people going from think tanks into the government, from the government into think tanks, into the military-industrial complex, into companies that use their expertise in order then to lobby the Pentagon and to lobby the government for more weapons in order to then take money out of social services, out of things that should be helping the people in order to build this huge, this mammoth undertaking, which is actually sucking dry this country. We have to stop that. Andrew Marshall is the head of the Office of Net Assessment. Matter of fact, he's been there since the 1970s, and every president since then has confirmed him to that post. The man is 89 years old right now, and he's still at the head of that department. I do believe he's the oldest bureaucrat still in office. And he was one of the, I wouldn't say one of the founders, but certainly one of the original scientists affiliated with RAND. He was also a good friend with Albert Wohlstetter, who is very prominently mentioned in my book. After all, Wohlstetter was the guy who came up with the concept of second strike capability, who was feeding all the missile gap information to the Kennedy camp, who almost single-handedly was able to turn around détente in the 1970s and to, again, scare the American people into thinking that the Soviet Union was actually more powerful than it really was. But that was Albert Wohlstetter. And Andrew Marshall was a buddy of his, and he's been around since then. And he was the one who came up with the whole concept of these new weapons, with the guided weapons that came up during the first Iraq War, during the Gulf War, those missiles that were able to turn corners and go into bunkers and explode. He came up with the whole concept of net wars. He came up with the whole concept of soldiers that actually would be androids in a way, because they put on this exoskeletal structure that would allow them to do what Superman does practically, to lift tanks with one hand, to sense things from miles away, to go on for days and not have to eat, sleep, or have any bodily functions. And who's still working on new weapons, who's thinking of new ways to basically to defeat the enemy. Because it doesn't matter who the enemy is, we have to defeat them, and we have to use more money and more resources that should be utilized for other things. And that's Andrew Marshall. Well, RAND has been involved in the militarization of police and of most government functions, actually. If by militarization you mean a structure whereby you have a command structure, where you have a central authority, and whereby you have experts who come in and determine what is to be done and what is the best way to handle things given a particular ideological perspective, yes, they've been involved. You've had it even in law enforcement. They came up with the whole concept of career criminals, with the whole concept of rational choice as the reason why criminals do things, why people get into crime, because they think that is the rational thing to do, which of course sociologists by now have discounted, but it doesn't matter. They've reshaped the whole discourse on how career criminals or how criminals behave. Yes, RAND was involved in that study, and they have been involved in reshaping the police throughout the country into the military because, again, of rational choice theory, which posits that self-interest is the driving force in all of human behavior. What I'm surprised is that, given all the bad economic news we've had over the past 2 years, that we really have not seen those riots. I was expecting them as well. I guess it just points to the patience of the American people and how, in a way, you really have to push us before we really start acting up like that. I don't think that they see the American people as the enemy per se. I think that the American people is seen by technocrats out of RAND and think tanks like it as the peons. The peons who are to be told what to do and how to do it because, after all, they know better. They know what's better for you. Don't bother coming around with ideas of this is how we want to do things, this is how we've always done it, or local governments should decide this. No, no, no. We have come up with a plan, and this is the plan that you should follow. I mean, it's classical RAND, and it's been there since its creation because they are the technocrats, and technocrats will rule the world because they have reason on their side. RAND did not quite develop game theory, although its first and foremost advocate, von Neumann, worked at RAND for a number of years, and obviously John Nash, who's the most popular figure in game theory, also worked at RAND for a number of years. They didn't come up with it, but they certainly harbored it, and they certainly hired so many people who worked there during the heyday of game theory in the 1950s. Again, it all stems from the concept of reason and self-interest. That people, since people are following self-interest and people are only looking out for themselves, therefore it stands to reason that they would think in numerical concepts. They would think of life in quantitative terms, and that they would only be looking out for themselves. After all, game theory develops as a way of, again, trying to divine what others will do under unknown circumstances, and again, thinking that people are always self-interested actors. There's no such thing as altruism in game theory. And therefore, it becomes rational, so to speak, that if you have to give up your best friend because you're going to get an advantage, that you will do so. And if you have to turn your back on the doctrines that your country has always held dear, that you will do so as well, because you stand to gain. Obviously, people are not like that. And that's one of the things that RAND found out in the late 50s and the late 60s, when dealing with people who refused to act as rational actors, namely the Viet Cong. That was like the first major experience that RAND had of people who were not rational. Because rational theory held, well, and it was what the U.S. government was doing in Vietnam at the time. We were saying, well, if we bomb them long and hard enough, they'll come to the bargaining table because they'll see we're going to wipe them out. They realized, after a while, it doesn't work, because these people believe in a cause greater than themselves. And therefore, with those people appealing to rational self-interest doesn't work. You have to appeal to something else. Ultimately, RAND gave up on game theory as a prognosticator of human behavior because they realized that humans are much more than that. However, that didn't stop them from using that theory then to turn us all into consumers, knowing that they can appeal to that particular aspect of human nature, because after all, we do have that within ourselves. We do have self-interest. Obviously, we have to look out for ourselves, but humans are much more than that. We believe in God. We believe in our country. We believe in helping others, even if we don't get anything out of it ourselves. And those are things that don't fit into that neat theory called rational choice. And it certainly doesn't fit into game theory. As you probably know, I was born in Cuba. And I was there in the early years of the communist revolution in that country. And I saw what they were trying to do. They were trying to turn people into different people, into what they call the new man. And thus I know what an authoritarian and autocratic technocracy wants to do. And that's what they were trying to do back in Cuba. So when I first heard of RAND, I mean, I thought, oh, it's ridiculous. I mean, that can't exist. That can't happen in this country. And then I thought, well, you know, that's the figment of some pothead who's thinking, oh, you know, it's all these guys, we're all these going around, and they're creating all these monsters that don't exist. So when I approached RAND, I came in, you know, as somebody who had actually done some research on actual plots that had been authorized by real madmen, which is what Hitler was, because my previous book dealt with terrorists who had been authorized by Adolf Hitler to come to this country and start a wave of terror right after Pearl Harbor. And I came up to them and asked them, you know, I'd like to do a book on you. I don't think anybody has really done anything on you. And, you know, I'd like to see what you're doing and, you know, what your contribution to American politics and to world history has been. Much to my surprise, they said, we'll do it. And, you know, we'll open up our archives to you. Our only proviso is that we ask that, you know, you tell us what it is that you're going to be dealing with and that, you know, that you tell us what is it that you want to do. And I told them, I said, I want to look at everything. I want to see everything that you've done. I want to see the good and the bad. And they open up their archives. And, you know, I have nothing bad to say about them when it comes to that. I have nothing bad to say about them personally either. I think they're all, and this is the tragic part of it, they're all honorable men. But, you know, isn't that what I think it was Mark Antony said in Julius Caesar? They're all honorable men. Be that as it may, they opened up their archives, and I went into it, and at the beginning I thought, this can't be true. I mean, because I started seeing what they were doing. And I guess they were doing it with the best of intentions. After all, they do believe that reason is a good thing, that unbridled reason is an even better thing, which of course I totally disagree with. And once I saw what they were doing, I just had to come to my own conclusions. I do believe that Rand expected me to give him a pat on the back and say, that's the way to go, fellas. You know, I mean, good for you. Let's show him what people who believe in reason can do. But, you know, I mean, I was born in a country that tried to do that and went nowhere. And right now, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. You know, everybody's poor right now over there. It's a mess. And I've seen what happens when you have a small group of people that pretend to speak on behalf of the majority. And I just cannot accept that. I'm a real believer in democracy. I'm really grateful to this country for having given me a chance to grow up here and to see what democracy is all about, and to realize that, you know, it's really what those people back in the 60s were saying, only now I really believe in it, which is really power to the people. I mean, it's really the people of this country that really have to rise up and say, this is what we want to do. And we have to stop small groups of technocrats and self-appointed messiahs to come and tell us, this is what's good for you, and this is what you have to do. It's up to us to decide what our future is. It's up to the American people to decide what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And I hope nobody ever forgets that. Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming another Cuba. Stay informed. You have to know things. You can't rely on somebody else coming and telling you, this is what's good for you. No. We have to go out and we have to do the research ourselves. You have to find out what is going on in this world. And who are the people who are really looking out for you, and who are the people who are really not acting in your best interests. An informed people is the best defense against tyranny. And I'm afraid that unless we continually keep that in front of us, unless we stay informed, unless we stay vigilant, as Thomas Jefferson warned us, that we'll be facing great danger in the years ahead. Now, one of the oddest things about rational choice is how it affects your medical care. Now remember, rational choice means that you're looking out for self-interest, right? You're looking out for yourself, right? Now, what people don't realize is that medical plans up until the 1970s approximately pay for everything. There were no deductibles. what you and I pay as deductibles right now came out of something called the Rand medical experiment. President Nixon wanted to cut back on the amount of money that the federal government was spending on Medicare. So therefore, it authorized Rand to conduct an experiment, and it did so with tens of thousands of people, whereby they were offered certain kinds of medical treatment and medical benefits, and others were not, depending on how much people were going to use them. It turned out that most people did not really want to use all the benefits to which they were entitled, and that apparently people did not object when they had to pay a small sum for the deductible. And seeing that people did not object, and that they were going to be getting more or less the same kind of treatment and the same kind of benefits, the federal government decided, well, from now on, I guess we'll just impose a deductible on Medicare, on all the medical benefits that we offer. When the federal government started doing that, first in certain select localities, and then throughout the country, private practice, private industry looked at it and said, hey, if they're doing it, we can do it now. So then deductibles began very small at first. I don't know if people will remember that, but it used to be just a few dollars. But now it then started increasing and increasing and increasing until at the end it became almost like the employee was mostly responsible for the lion's share of whatever the medical costs were going to be. So that's one of the things that we can thank Rand for. Your deductible, your medical deductible, straight out of a Rand experiment. If nobody opposes them, they'll go ahead and say, well, let's impose it. That's why I always say it's an informed public. It's the American people that can stop this. The American people are an ethical people. They're patriotic people. They know what's right and they know what's wrong. And they know what works and they know what doesn't. And unless we speak up, these things will happen. And people will come up with these cockamamie plans, with these weird things whereby they expect us to pull the money out of our pockets and pay for something that we don't have to, because we don't speak up, because we don't say, no, that's not the way it's going to be. We think different. Unless we speak up, this will continue to happen. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
Visit Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. When you're on the sites, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.